The law was simple, but its consequences were not. In the Ottoman Empire, survival at the top demanded the elimination of blood. Brotherhood was not protection. It was a threat waiting to mature. Long before it became codified, the logic of dynastic violence had already embedded itself into the political structure of the early Ottoman state. The empire was not born into stability. It expanded through constant warfare, fragile alliances, and internal uncertainty. In such an environment, succession was never a ceremonial transition. It was a moment of maximum vulnerability. The roots of this brutality can be traced back to the aftermath of the Battle of Ankara in 1402, when Timur defeated Bayezid I. The Ottoman state did not simply lose a battle, it fractured. Bayezid's sons turned against one another in a prolonged civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. There was no clear law governing succession, no established principle of primogeniture. Every prince had a claim, and every claim had to be defended by force. This period of chaos left a lasting mark on Ottoman political thinking. The lesson was not interpreted as a failure of unity, but as a failure of control. Multiple heirs meant inevitable conflict, and conflict at the center meant weakness at the borders, where enemies were always watching. When Mehmed II rose to power, he did not inherit a stable tradition. He inherited a system that had already nearly collapsed under its own internal divisions. His reign marked a turning point, not only in territorial expansion, but in administrative discipline and calculated severity. After capturing Constantinople in 1453, Mehmed II began restructuring the empire into a centralized authority. It was during this process that he formalized a principle that had already existed in practice: the elimination of rival claimants within the royal family. This principle became known as the law of fratricide. Its wording was deliberate and precise. It permitted a reigning sultan to execute his brothers in the interest of state stability. The justification was not personal. It was framed as necessity. The preservation of order outweighed the preservation of kinship. This was not impulsive cruelty. It was a structured political mechanism. In the Ottoman worldview of the 15th and 16th centuries, the state was not an abstract institution. It was embodied in the person of the sultan. His survival ensured continuity. His hesitation risked collapse. A rival prince was not merely a family member. He was a potential center of rebellion. Each prince was typically sent to govern a province, gaining administrative and military experience. This system, while effective in training rulers, also created independent bases of power. When a sultan died, these princes would race toward the capital, often gathering forces along the way. The first to secure the throne would then face an immediate decision. Delay meant danger. There are recorded instances where hesitation proved costly. Supporters of rival princes could mobilize quickly. Provincial loyalties could shift. Military factions could intervene. The empire required a single, uncontested authority. Anything less risked fragmentation. Thus, execution became policy. The methods were deliberate. Royal blood was not to be spilled. Princes were typically strangled with a silk cord, a practice both symbolic and controlled. It preserved a sense of imperial dignity while ensuring efficiency. The execution was often carried out by palace officials trained for this purpose. These acts were not public spectacles. They were contained within the palace, conducted in silence. Yet their meaning was widely understood. One of the earliest defining applications of this law occurred under Mehmed II himself. Upon securing his rule, he ordered the execution of his infant half-brother. The child posed no immediate threat, but time would change that. Potential alone was considered sufficient justification. This act was not recorded as an exception. It became precedent. Over time, the practice became normalized within the imperial structure. It was no longer a reaction to crisis. It was an expected step in succession. Each new sultan understood what awaited his brothers. The psychological consequences were severe. Princes grew up knowing that their survival depended not only on ability, but on timing and alliances. Trust within the royal family became impossible. Every relationship carried calculation. Mothers of princes became deeply involved in these dynamics. Their status depended on the success of their sons. This created additional tension within the palace. The system produced strong rulers. It also produced fear. By the time of Selim I, the logic of fratricide had intensified further. Selim moved against his own family to secure power. His actions were not condemned. They were seen as necessary strength. Under his rule, the empire expanded significantly. His effectiveness reinforced the belief that decisive action at succession was essential. This pattern continued with Suleiman. His reign is remembered for stability, yet the underlying system remained unchanged. As the empire expanded, its administration became more complex. However, succession remained unresolved in any humane sense. The law of fratricide endured because it addressed a recurring danger. Yet its long-term consequences began to reshape the empire. Princes became cautious. Some were sheltered. Others were kept within the palace instead of governing provinces. This shift began to affect leadership quality. The system that once produced capable rulers began to generate isolated individuals shaped by fear. The palace transformed into a space of containment. What had begun as a solution to instability was slowly creating a different kind of vulnerability. The transformation did not happen suddenly. It emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the internal logic of survival began to reshape the structure it once protected. What had been designed as a mechanism of stability was beginning to alter the very character of Ottoman rule across successive generations. By the late 16th century, the system that once produced decisive and battle-tested rulers was showing signs of strain. The earlier model had relied on exposure. Princes governed provinces, commanded troops, and learned to navigate real administrative challenges. Their eventual struggle for the throne, though violent, ensured that the victor was experienced, hardened, and politically aware. But this model carried risks that could no longer be ignored. Every provincial assignment meant another potential rebellion. Every prince with a following represented a future crisis waiting for the moment of succession. The cost of this system was not only measured in blood, but in instability that could spread beyond the palace and into distant provinces. Gradually, a shift began to take hold within the imperial structure itself. Instead of sending princes to govern distant regions, they were increasingly kept within the imperial palace. This practice, later formalized as the kaffe system, did not initially appear as imprisonment. It was presented as protection. But in reality, it was a controlled form of confinement designed to limit political risk. Princes were isolated from political life. They were removed from military command. They were denied the experience that had once defined Ottoman leadership. This was not an act of mercy. It was a strategic adjustment intended to prevent internal collapse. By limiting the independence of princes, the empire reduced the likelihood of coordinated uprisings during succession. A confined prince could not build alliances. He could not raise an army. He could not challenge authority until the moment of transition, and by then his capabilities remained uncertain and untested. The logic of fratricide had not disappeared. It had evolved into something quieter but equally consequential. Instead of eliminating rivals through immediate execution, the system now delayed and controlled them. Survival no longer depended solely on speed and decisiveness. It depended on endurance within confinement, patience within uncertainty, and silence within walls that restricted movement and knowledge. This change had profound psychological consequences for those raised within such conditions. Princes developed differently from their predecessors. They were no longer shaped by governance or warfare. Their world was restricted to palace corridors, controlled routines, and limited interaction with a carefully monitored circle of attendants. Suspicion replaced experience. Imagination replaced strategy. The uncertainty remained constant and unavoidable. At any moment, a prince could be elevated to the throne or executed upon another's rise. This dual possibility created a state of permanent tension within the palace environment. Some adapted by becoming cautious and withdrawn. Others displayed signs of instability, shaped by years of isolation and unpredictability. Historical accounts indicate that prolonged confinement affected emotional resilience, judgment, and clarity in ways that could not be easily corrected once power was suddenly granted. Yet the system persisted because it solved an immediate and visible problem. Large-scale civil wars became less frequent. The empire no longer faced the same level of open dynastic conflict that had once threatened its existence during earlier centuries. From a structural perspective, the containment strategy appeared effective and even necessary. But the cost was delayed rather than eliminated. As the quality of leadership shifted, so did governance across the empire. Sultans who ascended from isolation often lacked practical experience. They relied more heavily on advisors, court factions, and established administrative institutions to maintain authority and continuity. Power began to diffuse, subtly at first, then more noticeably over time. The imperial center remained intact, but its internal dynamics were changing in ways that would shape the empire's future. The role of the janissaries grew more influential in political decisions. Bureaucratic elites gained leverage within administrative systems. The authority of the sultan, once reinforced by personal capability and military experience, became increasingly dependent on surrounding structures and negotiated influence. This was not an immediate collapse of authority. It was a gradual transformation. The earlier system had produced rulers who imposed authority through direct action and experience. The later system produced rulers who managed authority through delegation and reliance on established networks. Fratricide itself did not disappear. It remained a legal and accepted option within the Ottoman framework, but its frequency declined as confinement reduced the perceived threat of rival princes within the palace. Execution was no longer always necessary. Control could be maintained through restriction, surveillance, and carefully limited exposure to power. Yet the underlying principle remained unchanged. The state still prioritized stability over kinship, order over compassion, and survival over familial bonds. The difference was in method, not intent. There were still moments when the old brutality resurfaced. Instances where multiple princes were executed upon a single succession reminded observers that the foundational logic had not been abandoned. It had merely adapted to new political conditions. Observers within and outside the empire began to note these changes over time. Foreign diplomats recorded the increasing isolation of princes. They observed the structured silence of the palace, the absence of visible succession struggles, and a controlled nature of power transitions that replaced earlier violent contests. To some, this appeared as stability and discipline. To others, it suggested stagnation and hidden weakness. Internally, the perception was more complex. For the ruling elite, the system offered predictability. It reduced the chaos that had once accompanied every transition of power. But it also introduced uncertainty shaped by rulers who had never been tested before ascending the throne. This uncertainty revealed itself gradually through administrative decisions, military responses, and moments of crisis that required clarity and decisiveness. Some sultans adapted despite their confinement. They relied on capable advisors, learned quickly, and maintained control over the empire's direction. Others struggled, their inexperience becoming evident in moments that demanded immediate and decisive action. The empire continued to function and project power, but its internal balance was shifting. What had once been a system driven by direct and often violent competition was becoming one defined by controlled succession and indirect power dynamics. The visible brutality of fratricide declined, but its deeper psychological and structural consequences intensified beneath the surface. The palace became a place of waiting. Waiting for elevation. Waiting for survival. Waiting for a moment that could not be predicted or controlled. And in that waiting, the nature of Ottoman leadership was being quietly redefined, reshaped by isolation, and weakened by the very system designed to protect it. Silence inside the palace did not mean safety. It meant calculation without movement. And in that stillness, decisions were made that never left written orders. By the early 17th century, the Ottoman system of succession had fully transitioned into a structure defined less by open conflict and more by controlled unpredictability. The violence had not disappeared. It had been absorbed into the architecture of the palace itself, hidden behind walls that concealed both fear and authority. The cave system now functioned as a permanent feature of imperial life. Princes were no longer temporary occupants of confinement. For many, it became a lifelong condition. They lived in restricted quarters, often separated from broader court activity, with limited access to information about the outside world. Their education was inconsistent, their experiences narrow, and their understanding of governance largely theoretical. This environment produced a new type of ruler, one who inherited absolute power without gradual exposure to its responsibilities. One who had observed politics only from a distance, filtered through controlled narratives and personal anxieties. The consequences of this shift became visible during the reign of Ahmed I. Unlike his predecessors, Ahmed ascended the throne at a young age and chose not to execute his brother Mustafa. This decision marked a significant deviation from established practice. It was not an act of compassion alone. It reflected a growing awareness that continuous execution within the dynasty carried risks of its own. The Ottoman line was not infinite. Repeated fratricide had reduced the number of viable heirs. Preserving members of the dynasty became a strategic necessity. But preservation introduced a new problem: survival without purpose. Mustafa was kept alive but confined. When Ahmed died, Mustafa was elevated to the throne. It was the first time in Ottoman history that a ruler who had spent years in isolation, without administrative or military experience, assumed power. The result was instability that did not come from open rebellion, but from uncertainty at the center. Mustafa's reign was short and marked by inconsistency. He struggled to assert authority. Decisions were influenced by surrounding figures. Control became fragmented. This was not a failure of character alone. It was the outcome of a system that had replaced preparation with preservation. The pattern repeated itself in subsequent successions. Princes who had spent years, sometimes decades, in confinement were suddenly expected to govern a vast empire. The transition was abrupt. There was no gradual assumption of responsibility, no testing of capability, no exposure to the complexities of administration before power was granted. The psychological impact of confinement became politically visible. Some rulers displayed hesitation in critical moments. Others relied heavily on advisors, allowing court factions to gain influence. The balance of power within the empire began to shift away from the individual authority of the sultan toward a more distributed structure. The imperial harem, once primarily a domestic institution, gained political significance. Valide sultans, the mothers of reigning rulers, often acted as intermediaries and power brokers. Their influence expanded as inexperienced sultans depended on trusted figures within their immediate environment. This period, sometimes referred to by historians as the Sultanate of Women, was not a formal political system. It was an adaptive response to the conditions created by confinement and inexperience. Authority did not disappear. It changed form. While the earlier model of succession had emphasized decisive elimination of rivals, the new system emphasized controlled preservation. But preservation came with consequences that extended beyond individual reigns. The Janissaries, already a powerful military institution, became increasingly involved in political outcomes. Their support or opposition could determine the stability of a ruler. In the absence of strong personal authority, military backing became essential. This introduced a new layer of dependency. The Sultan was no longer the sole center of power. He was part of a network that could support him, influence him, or in certain cases, remove him. Deposition became a possibility. This was a fundamental shift. Earlier rulers faced threats primarily from rival princes. Now, they faced pressure from within the state itself. The mechanism of control had expanded. Fratricide had once eliminated external threats within the dynasty. The cave system reduced those threats but created internal vulnerabilities. Power was no longer contested openly among brothers. It was negotiated, influenced, and sometimes destabilized by those who operated within the palace and military structure. Despite these changes, the empire did not immediately weaken. Its administrative systems remained effective. Its territorial control persisted. Its military campaigns continued. But the nature of leadership had altered. It was less direct, less personal, more dependent. The long-term effects of this transformation were subtle but cumulative. Each generation of rulers inherited not only the throne, but the limitations imposed by the system that preserved them. Experience could not be replaced after accession. Authority could not be fully asserted without prior exposure. Confidence could not be constructed instantly. And yet, the structure remained in place. Because the alternative, returning to open dynastic conflict, was considered more dangerous. The memory of the interregnum still lingered in Ottoman consciousness. The fear of fragmentation outweighed the concerns about internal weakness. Stability, even if imperfect, was prioritized. The system had achieved its immediate goal. It prevented civil war, but it introduced a slower, less visible form of instability, one that did not erupt in open conflict, but manifested in governance, decision-making, and a shifting balance of power within the empire. And within the palace walls, where silence still defined daily life, the next generation of princes waited, not for training, not for preparation, but for a moment that would arrive without warning, a moment that would demand authority they had never practiced, a moment that would determine survival or erasure. And in that uncertainty, the legacy of fratricide continued, no longer through immediate execution, but through a system that shaped rulers before they ever ruled. Power within the palace had not disappeared. It had shifted, redistributed, and concealed itself behind ritual and silence. What could not be contested openly was now controlled indirectly. By the mid-17th century, the Ottoman system had entered a phase where the consequences of earlier decisions were no longer theoretical. They were visible in governance, in military hesitation, and in the increasing influence of individuals who were never meant to rule. The Sultan remained the symbolic center of the empire. His authority was still absolute in theory. Orders were issued in his name. Legitimacy flowed through his position. But in practice, that authority was increasingly mediated by others. The most immediate circle around the Sultan had become the most powerful. The imperial harem, once a controlled domestic environment, evolved into a political space where influence could be exercised with precision. This transformation was not sudden. It developed gradually as inexperienced rulers relied on those they trusted most. At the center of this shift stood the Valide Sultan. As the mother of the reigning ruler, she possessed both proximity and legitimacy. She had survived the internal dynamics of the palace. She understood its structure, and in many cases, she had actively shaped her son's survival. Her influence was not ceremonial. It was strategic. Through appointments, recommendations, and control over access, the Valide Sultan could shape decisions without issuing commands publicly. Her authority operated within the boundaries of tradition, but its impact extended far beyond them. This was not an official transfer of power. It was an adaptation. In a system where rulers often lacked preparation, those closest to them filled the gaps. The Grand Vizier also became more central. As the highest-ranking official in the administrative hierarchy, the Grand Vizier had always played a significant role. But now, his position carried even greater weight. He was expected to compensate for the inexperience of the Sultan, to maintain continuity, and to manage the complexities of an expanding empire. This concentration of responsibility created both stability and risk. A capable Grand Vizier could strengthen the state. An ambitious one could dominate it. The balance between loyalty and control became increasingly delicate. At the same time, the Janissaries expanded their political presence. Originally established as an elite military corps loyal to the Sultan, they had evolved into a powerful institution with its own interests. Their role in succession became more pronounced. Their support could secure a ruler's position. Their opposition could destabilize it. This was not a formal system of governance. It was an accumulation of influence. The result was a structure where authority was shared, negotiated, and sometimes contested within the inner framework of the empire. Fratricide had once simplified succession by eliminating rivals. The cave system had preserved potential claimants. Now, the existence of multiple surviving princes introduced a different kind of tension. A deposed ruler could be replaced. A confined prince could be elevated. The line between stability and disruption became thinner. This shift was evident during periods of deposition. Sultans were no longer untouchable. They could be removed without the collapse of the entire system. This possibility altered the perception of authority. The position of the sultan remained sacred. The individual holding it became more vulnerable. The psychological implications were significant. A ruler who knew he could be replaced governed differently from one who faced only external threats. Decision-making became cautious. Assertiveness was balanced against the risk of provoking opposition from powerful factions. This did not lead to immediate decline. It led to controlled governance. The empire continued to operate. Its institutions remained functional. Its territories were maintained. But the internal dynamics were shifting toward a more complex and less centralized model. One of the most revealing examples of this transformation can be seen during the reign of Murad IV. Unlike many of his predecessors, Murad IV sought to reassert direct authority. He recognized the fragmentation of power and moved aggressively to restore centralized control. His methods were severe. He imposed strict discipline within the capital. He targeted corruption. He reigned in the Janissaries. He attempted to reverse the gradual diffusion of authority that had taken place over previous decades. For a time, he succeeded. Order was restored. Control was reestablished. But his approach relied heavily on personal force. It was not institutional reform. When Murad IV died, the structure he had imposed did not sustain itself. The underlying system remained unchanged. The cycle resumed. This pattern highlighted a critical reality. Individual strength could temporarily alter the balance of power, but it could not permanently resolve the structural consequences of the succession system. The empire had become dependent on the capabilities of each ruler, and those capabilities were increasingly unpredictable. Some rulers managed effectively. Others struggled. The variability itself became a defining feature. Fratricide had once ensured that only the most capable contender survived. The cave system removed that filter. Now, capability was no longer guaranteed. It was a variable introduced at the moment of accession. This unpredictability extended beyond the palace. Provincial governors adapted to the changing center. Military leaders adjusted their expectations. Diplomatic actors observed the internal shifts. The empire's external image remained strong. Its internal coherence required constant management. The long-term consequences were not immediate collapse. They were gradual adjustments. Power became more distributed. Authority became more conditional. Stability became more dependent on coordination rather than dominance. And within the palace, the next generation of princes continued to wait. Not as rivals preparing for conflict. Not as administrators gaining experience, but as potential rulers shaped by isolation, uncertainty, and observation. They inherited not only a throne, but a system that would define how they could use it. A system built on survival, refined through control, and sustained by the belief that any alternative would be far more dangerous. Violence had not vanished from the Ottoman system. It had become selective, calculated, and hidden behind institutional order. What was once immediate had become conditional. By the late 17th century, the empire was no longer defined by the same brutal clarity that had characterized its earlier centuries. The practice of fratricide, while still legally permissible, was no longer applied with the same consistency. The cave system had altered the structure of succession, but it had not eliminated the underlying tension that defined it. Instead, it redistributed that tension across time. Princes were no longer executed immediately upon a ruler's accession. Many were preserved within confinement, their existence tolerated as long as they posed no immediate threat. This created a new political reality in which multiple potential claimants to the throne existed simultaneously, each one a latent source of instability. The difference was timing. Execution, when it occurred, was no longer automatic. It was reactive. A prince might live for years within the palace, only to be eliminated if circumstances shifted. Suspicion, rather than policy alone, became the trigger. This introduced a layer of unpredictability that extended beyond the royal family and into the broader structure of governance. The empire had entered a phase where control relied less on predetermined action and more on continuous assessment. This change affected how power was perceived. The earlier system had been direct. A new sultan secured his rule through decisive elimination of rivals. The message was immediate and unmistakable. Authority was absolute because it was uncontested. Now authority existed alongside possibility. A living prince represented an alternative. Even if confined, his presence carried symbolic weight. In times of dissatisfaction, factions within the court or military could look toward him as a replacement. The mere existence of another option altered the stability of the reigning sultan. This dynamic became particularly significant during periods of crisis. Military setbacks, economic strain, or administrative failure could weaken confidence in the ruler. In such moments, the presence of surviving princes introduced a mechanism for change that did not require rebellion against the institution itself. The system allowed for internal correction, but that correction came with its own risks. Deposition became more frequent. A sultan could be removed and replaced by another member of the dynasty without dismantling the structure of the state. This process, while less destructive than civil war, still introduced instability at the highest level of authority. Each deposition carried consequences. It signaled that power was conditional. It demonstrated that authority could be withdrawn, and it reinforced the influence of those capable of orchestrating such changes. The janissaries played a central role in this environment. Their position had evolved far beyond their original military function. They were no longer just an elite fighting force. They were a political entity with the capacity to influence succession. Their interests were not always aligned with those of the sultan. When dissatisfaction grew, they could act. Their involvement in depositions was not always overtly violent, but it was decisive. Their support or opposition could determine the outcome of internal struggles. This gave them leverage that extended into policy, appointments, and governance. The Grand Vizier also operated within this shifting framework. His authority depended on maintaining balance. He had to manage the expectations of the military, the court, and the ruler himself. His position required adaptability, but it also exposed him to risk. Failure to maintain stability could lead to removal, exile, or execution. Power, at every level, had become conditional. This was the long-term consequence of a system that had replaced clear succession with controlled uncertainty. The empire did not collapse under this structure. It adapted. Administrative systems continued to function. Taxation was maintained. Territorial control persisted. But the internal cohesion required constant negotiation. The psychological dimension of this system extended beyond the princes. It affected every participant in the structure of power. Trust became limited. Loyalty became strategic. Decisions were influenced not only by immediate needs, but by potential future outcomes. The presence of multiple surviving princes ensured that the question of succession was never fully resolved. It remained an ongoing factor in political calculation. Even during periods of relative stability, the underlying tension did not disappear. It remained contained, and containment required vigilance. This vigilance shaped the behavior of rulers. A sultan had to consider not only external threats, but internal perception. His authority depended on maintaining confidence among key groups. Military support, administrative efficiency, court loyalty. Any imbalance could create an opening, and that opening could be used. The system had become self-regulating in a complex way. It prevented large-scale civil war, but it allowed smaller, controlled disruptions. These disruptions did not destroy the empire. They reshaped it. Over time, this led to a gradual shift in how power was exercised. It became less about dominance, more about management, less about elimination, more about containment. Fratricide had not disappeared. It had become one option among many. Its use was now influenced by context rather than tradition alone. This reflected a broader transformation. The empire was no longer operating under the same assumptions that had defined its early expansion. It had grown larger, more complex, more dependent on internal balance. The mechanisms of control had evolved accordingly. But evolution did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. The system that had once relied on immediate, irreversible decisions now depended on continuous adjustment. An adjustment required awareness. Awareness of threats. Awareness of alliances. Awareness of perception. Within the palace, the next generation of princes continued to exist within this environment. They were no longer certain victims, but they were not secure. Their survival depended on factors beyond their control. Their future depended on circumstances they could not influence. They were part of a system that preserved them but did not prepare them. A system that protected the dynasty but altered its character. And as the empire moved forward, the legacy of fratricide remained embedded within its structure. Not always visible, not always immediate, but always present, shaping decisions, influencing outcomes, defining the limits of power. Control could be maintained through restriction, surveillance, and carefully limited exposure to power. Yet the underlying principle remained unchanged. The state still prioritized stability over kinship, order over compassion, and survival over familial bonds. The difference was in method, not intent. There were still moments when the old brutality resurfaced. Instances where multiple princes were executed upon a single succession reminded observers that the foundational logic had not been abandoned. It had merely adapted to new political conditions. Observers within and outside the empire began to note these changes over time. Foreign diplomats recorded the increasing isolation of princes. They observed the structured silence of the palace, the absence of visible succession struggles, and a controlled nature of power transitions that replaced earlier violent contests. To some, this appeared as stability and discipline. To others, it suggested stagnation and hidden weakness. Internally, the perception was more complex. For the ruling elite, the system offered predictability. It reduced the chaos that had once accompanied every transition of power. But it also introduced uncertainty shaped by rulers who had never been tested before ascending the throne. This uncertainty revealed itself gradually through administrative decisions, military responses, and moments of crisis that required clarity and decisiveness. Some sultans adapted despite their confinement. They relied on capable advisors, learned quickly, and maintained control over the empire's direction. Others struggled, their inexperience becoming evident in moments that demanded immediate and decisive action. The empire continued to function and project power, but its internal balance was shifting. What had once been a system driven by direct and often violent competition was becoming one defined by controlled succession and indirect power dynamics. The visible brutality of fratricide declined, but its deeper psychological and structural consequences intensified beneath the surface. The palace became a place of waiting, waiting for elevation, waiting for survival, waiting for a moment that could not be predicted or controlled. And in that waiting, the nature of Ottoman leadership was being quietly redefined, reshaped by isolation, and weakened by the very system designed to protect it. By the 18th century, the Ottoman system of succession had settled into a pattern that no longer relied on immediate violence, yet still carried the weight of its earlier brutality. The executions had become less frequent, but the logic behind them had not disappeared. It remained embedded in the structure, shaping behavior even when it was not enforced. The dynasty had survived its most unstable phases. The fear of total internal collapse, which had once justified systematic fratricide, had been replaced by a more calculated concern: continuity. Preserving the ruling line became as important as controlling it. This balance between survival and restraint defined the new phase of Ottoman governance. Princes continued to live within the kafes, but by now, the system had become normalized. It was no longer seen as an emergency measure. It was part of the expected order of imperial life. A prince was born into confinement. He grew within it, and he understood, from an early stage, that his existence was conditional. This normalization had consequences that extended beyond individual psychology. It reshaped the identity of the ruling class. Earlier Ottoman rulers had defined themselves through action: military campaigns, administrative reforms, territorial expansion. Their authority had been reinforced by visible achievements. Now, authority was often inherited without prior demonstration. The transition from confinement to rule remained abrupt. There was no gradual integration into governance, no progressive assumption of responsibility. The moment of accession remained a rupture, and that rupture produced uneven results. Some rulers adapted. They relied on experienced officials, learned quickly, and managed to assert a degree of control. Others struggled to navigate the complexities of power. Their decisions reflected uncertainty. Their reliance on advisors increased, and with that reliance came influence from those who operated around them. The Grand Vizier's role became even more critical. He functioned as the operational center of the empire. Administrative continuity depended on his competence. Military coordination relied on his direction. Diplomatic strategy was shaped through his decisions. In many ways, he became the executor of authority that the Sultan symbolized. This did not eliminate the Sultan's power, but it redefined its application. Authority became layered. The Sultan remained the source. The Grand Vizier became the instrument. This division required balance. A strong Grand Vizier could stabilize the empire, but excessive influence risked overshadowing the ruler. This tension was constant. At the same time, the Janissaries continued to assert their position. Their transformation from disciplined military corps to political force had long-term implications. They were no longer passive instruments of the state. They had interests, they had expectations, and they had the capacity to act when those expectations were not met. Their involvement in internal affairs became a defining feature of the period. They could support a ruler, they could oppose him, and in certain circumstances, they could remove him. This reality altered the structure of authority at its core. The Sultan was no longer insulated from internal pressure. His position depended on maintaining equilibrium among powerful groups. Failure to do so carried consequences, not always immediate, but always possible. The system had evolved into one of managed stability. It avoided large-scale civil war, but it allowed controlled disruption. This disruption acted as a corrective mechanism. A ruler who failed to maintain balance could be replaced. A new ruler could be introduced without dismantling the entire system. This flexibility contributed to the empire's longevity, but it also introduced a new form of instability. Continuity was preserved. Consistency was not guaranteed. Each transition brought uncertainty, not in the structure, but in its execution. The psychological environment within the palace reflected this reality. Princes lived with awareness, not of immediate execution, but of conditional existence. Their survival was no longer threatened by automatic policy, but it was not secure. Circumstances could change, perceptions could shift, and with that shift, their position could alter rapidly. This uncertainty influenced behavior. Caution became instinctive. Ambition became restrained. Expression became limited. The environment did not encourage initiative. It encouraged survival. And survival did not produce the same qualities as preparation. This distinction became increasingly significant as the empire faced external challenges. Military competition intensified. European powers advanced technologically and strategically. Diplomatic complexity increased. The empire required leadership capable of adaptation. But the system did not consistently produce such leadership. This gap did not result in immediate failure. The administrative structure compensated. Experienced officials maintained continuity. Institutional knowledge preserved function. But over time, the limitations became more apparent. Reform became necessary, and reform required initiative. Initiative required experience. Experience required exposure. The system provided none of these consistently. This created a tension between structural stability and adaptive capacity. The empire could maintain itself, but its ability to transform was constrained. Fratricide, in its earlier form, had ensured decisive leadership at a high cost. The caliph's system preserved life at the cost of preparation. Both approaches addressed immediate risks. Neither resolved the deeper challenge of succession: how to transfer power without compromising capability. This question remained unanswered. And as the empire moved further into the 18th century, the consequences of that unresolved question became more visible, not through collapse, but through gradual imbalance. Decisions that required clarity were delayed. Responses that required speed were measured. Adaptation that required boldness was cautious. The system that had once prioritized survival above all else now faced a different requirement: evolution. But evolution could not occur without altering the structures that had ensured stability. And altering those structures carried risks that the empire had long sought to avoid. Within the palace, the pattern continued. Princes waited, not for conflict, not for preparation, but for selection. A moment determined by factors beyond their control. A moment that would define their role without prior testing. And in that moment, the legacy of centuries of calculated survival would converge with the immediate demands of rule. A convergence that did not always produce strength, but always produced consequence. By the 18th century, the Ottoman system of succession had settled into a pattern that no longer relied on immediate violence, yet still carried the weight of its earlier brutality. The executions had become less frequent, but the logic behind them had not disappeared. It remained embedded in the structure, shaping behavior even when it was not enforced. The dynasty had survived its most unstable phases. The fear of total internal collapse, which had once justified systematic fratricide, had been replaced by a more calculated concern: continuity. Preserving the ruling line became as important as controlling it. This balance between survival and restraint defined the new phase of Ottoman governance. Princes continued to live within the caliphs, but by now the system had become normalized. It was no longer seen as an emergency measure. It was part of the expected order of imperial life. A prince was born into confinement. He grew within it, and he understood, from an early stage, that his existence was conditional. This normalization had consequences that extended beyond individual psychology. It reshaped the identity of the ruling class. Earlier Ottoman rulers had defined themselves through action, military campaigns, administrative reforms, territorial expansion. Their authority had been reinforced by visible achievements. Now, authority was often inherited without prior demonstration. The transition from confinement to rule remained abrupt. There was no gradual integration into governance, no progressive assumption of responsibility. The moment of accession remained a rupture, and that rupture produced uneven results. Some rulers adapted. They relied on experienced officials, learned quickly, and managed to assert a degree of control. Others struggled to navigate the complexities of power. Their decisions reflected uncertainty. Their reliance on advisors increased, and with that reliance came influence from those who operated around them. The Grand Vizier's role became even more critical. He functioned as the operational center of the empire. Administrative continuity depended on his competence. Military coordination relied on his direction. Diplomatic strategy was shaped through his decisions. In many ways, he became the executor of authority that the sultan symbolized. This did not eliminate the sultan's power, but it redefined its application. Authority became layered. The sultan remained the source. The Grand Vizier became the instrument. This division required balance. A strong Grand Vizier could stabilize the empire, but excessive influence risked overshadowing the ruler. This tension was constant. At the same time, the Janissaries continued to assert their position. Their transformation from disciplined military corps to political force had long-term implications. They were no longer passive instruments of the state. They had interests, they had expectations, and they had the capacity to act when those expectations were not met. Their involvement in internal affairs became a defining feature of the period. They could support a ruler, they could oppose him, and in certain circumstances, they could remove him. This reality altered the structure of authority at its core. The Sultan was no longer insulated from internal pressure. His position depended on maintaining equilibrium among powerful groups. Failure to do so carried consequences, not always immediate, but always possible. The system had evolved into one of managed stability. It avoided large-scale civil war, but it allowed controlled disruption. This disruption acted as a corrective mechanism. A ruler who failed to maintain balance could be replaced. A new ruler could be introduced without dismantling the entire system. This flexibility contributed to the empire's longevity, but it also introduced a new form of instability. Continuity was preserved. Consistency was not guaranteed. Each transition brought uncertainty, not in the structure, but in its execution. The psychological environment within the palace reflected this reality. Princes lived with awareness, not of immediate execution, but of conditional existence. Their survival was no longer threatened by automatic policy, but it was not secure. Circumstances could change. Perceptions could shift, and with that shift, their position could alter rapidly. This uncertainty influenced behavior. Caution became instinctive. Ambition became restrained. Expression became limited. The environment did not encourage initiative. It encouraged survival. And survival did not produce the same qualities as preparation. This distinction became increasingly significant as the empire faced external challenges. Military competition intensified. European powers advanced technologically and strategically. Diplomatic complexity increased. The empire required leadership capable of adaptation. But the system did not consistently produce such leadership. This gap did not result in immediate failure. The administrative structure compensated. Experienced officials maintained continuity. Institutional knowledge preserved function. But over time, the limitations became more apparent. Reform became necessary, and reform required initiative. Initiative required experience. Experience required exposure. The system provided none of these consistently. This created a tension between structural stability and adaptive capacity. The empire could maintain itself, but its ability to transform was constrained. Fratricide, in its earlier form, had ensured decisive leadership at a high cost. The CAIF system preserved life at the cost of preparation. Both approaches addressed immediate risks. Neither resolved the deeper challenge of succession: how to transfer power without compromising capability. This question remained unanswered. And as the empire moved further into the 18th century, the consequences of that unresolved question became more visible, not through collapse, but through gradual imbalance. Decisions that required clarity were delayed. Responses that required speed were measured. Adaptation that required boldness was cautious. The system that had once prioritized survival above all else now faced a different requirement: evolution. But evolution could not occur without altering the structures that had ensured stability. And altering those structures carried risks that the empire had long sought to avoid. Within the palace, the pattern continued. Princes waited, not for conflict, not for preparation, but for selection. A moment determined by factors beyond their control. A moment that would define their role without prior testing. And in that moment, the legacy of centuries of calculated survival would converge with the immediate demands of rule. A convergence that did not always produce strength, but always produced consequence. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a point where survival alone was no longer sufficient to guarantee its position in a changing world. The structures that had preserved it for centuries were now being measured against systems that evolved more rapidly. What had once ensured continuity was beginning to define limitation. The system of succession, shaped over generations by fratricide and later by confinement, had achieved its primary objective. The dynasty endured. The line of rulers remained intact. The palace retained its authority, and the administrative machinery of the empire continued to function with recognizable stability. But the nature of the challenge had changed. It was no longer centered on internal fragmentation. It was defined by external comparison. European powers had entered a phase of accelerated transformation. Military organization became more structured. Technological development advanced with increasing speed. Administrative systems adapted to support expansion, efficiency, and coordination. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, operated within a framework that prioritized caution and continuity. This contrast became increasingly visible. Military encounters revealed disparities in training and organization. Diplomatic engagements exposed differences in strategic flexibility. Economic pressures highlighted inefficiencies that had previously remained manageable. The need for reform was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and unavoidable. Within this context, the role of the sultan gained renewed significance. Authority still originated from the throne, but the expectations attached to that authority had expanded. A ruler was now expected not only to preserve stability, but to initiate transformation across multiple domains. This required a different type of leadership, one capable of understanding external developments in detail, one willing to confront internal resistance, one able to coordinate change across military, administrative, and financial systems. The existing structure did not consistently produce such leadership. Princes continued to grow within the controlled environment of the palace. Their education improved in certain areas, particularly in language and theoretical knowledge. Exposure to broader intellectual currents increased gradually. Yet practical experience remained limited. They did not command armies. They did not govern provinces. They did not engage directly with the complexities of administration before accession. The transition from confinement to authority remained abrupt. This gap influenced both the pace and the effectiveness of reform. Some rulers recognized the necessity of change. They initiated efforts to reorganize the military structure. They attempted to introduce new training methods. They sought to adopt elements of European organizational systems. These initiatives reflected an awareness that the empire could not remain static. But awareness alone did not ensure success. Implementation required support from within the system, and that support was not guaranteed. The Janissaries remained a central obstacle. Their established position within the empire provided them with both influence and a vested interest in preserving existing arrangements. Reforms that threatened their role or privileges were met with resistance. This resistance did not always take the form of open confrontation. It could appear as delay, as obstruction, or as indirect pressure applied through established channels. The challenge for the ruler was not only to design reform, but to enforce it effectively. This required authority that extended beyond symbolic legitimacy. It required practical control over institutions that had developed their own internal strength, control that the system did not always provide consistently. The Grand Vizier continued to function as the key intermediary. He translated intention into policy. He managed the administrative process. He coordinated implementation across different sectors of the state. His effectiveness often determined whether reform efforts advanced or stalled. But his position remained vulnerable. He operated within the same environment of conditional authority that affected all high officials. Failure could lead to removal. Success could generate opposition from those whose interests were threatened. This instability limited the continuity necessary for sustained transformation. As a result, the empire entered a recurring pattern. Reforms were initiated. Some progress was achieved. Resistance emerged. Momentum slowed or reversed. This pattern did not indicate a lack of effort. It reflected structural limitation. The system had been designed to prevent internal collapse. It had not been designed to facilitate continuous adaptation. Fratricide had once ensured decisive control over succession. The Caliph system had preserved the dynasty while reducing open conflict. Neither approach addressed the long-term requirement of preparing rulers for sustained reform across generations. This limitation became more apparent as external pressures intensified. Military defeats underscored the urgency of modernization. Diplomatic challenges required more flexible strategies. Economic strain revealed inefficiencies that demanded correction. Each of these pressures pointed toward the same conclusion. The empire needed to adapt in a coordinated and sustained manner. But adaptation required more than isolated initiatives. It required a shift in how authority functioned. Efforts to centralize power more effectively began to emerge. Attempts were made to reduce the influence of competing factions. New institutions were introduced to support reform. These measures represented an attempt to adjust the system from within rather than replace it entirely. The process was gradual. Resistance remained constant. Progress was uneven, yet the direction was clear. The empire was attempting to balance stability with the necessity of change. This balance was inherently difficult. Too much change risked internal disruption. Too little change risked external decline. The tension between these outcomes defined the period. Within the palace, the experience of princes began to shift in limited ways. Educational efforts expanded. Exposure to broader intellectual influences increased. But the fundamental structure remained intact. Practical engagement with governance before accession was still absent. Preparation remained indirect. Authority remained immediate. This disconnect continued to shape leadership outcomes. Some rulers adapted through determination and reliance on capable advisors. Others struggled within the constraints imposed by their upbringing. The variability in leadership remained a defining feature of the system. The empire did not collapse under these conditions. It adjusted. It absorbed pressure. It continued to function. But its ability to respond with speed and consistency was affected. The underlying question persisted. Could a system designed for survival evolve into one capable of sustained transformation? The answer was uncertain. It required confronting the legacy of earlier decisions. Decisions that had ensured continuity but limited flexibility. Fratricide had once defined the brutality of succession. Its disappearance did not erase its influence. It had left behind a structure that prioritized control over preparation, preservation over development, stability over adaptability. These priorities had allowed the empire to endure for centuries. Now, they challenged its ability to evolve in a world that no longer allowed gradual adjustment without consequence. And as the 19th century advanced, the empire would be forced to test whether its long tradition of controlled survival could support the demands of continuous change. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a reality it could no longer manage through gradual adjustment alone. The pressure was no longer distant or intermittent. It was constant, visible, and increasingly decisive. The structures that had preserved the empire for centuries were now under direct strain. External competition had intensified beyond traditional patterns. European powers were no longer simply rivals at the borders. They were active participants in shaping the political and economic environment in which the empire operated. This shift forced a deeper confrontation with internal limitations. The system of succession, once designed to prevent fragmentation, had succeeded in preserving dynastic continuity. The line of rulers remained intact. The palace still functioned as the symbolic and administrative center. But the question was no longer about preserving the line. It was about sustaining the state. Reform, which had previously been gradual and selective, now became urgent and comprehensive. This urgency marked a turning point. Efforts to reorganize the empire began to move beyond isolated initiatives. They expanded into broader programs aimed at restructuring administration, modernizing the military, and redefining the relationship between authority and governance. These efforts were not abstract. They were responses to immediate challenges. Military defeats had exposed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. Diplomatic pressures required new forms of negotiation and alignment. Economic dependencies revealed structural vulnerabilities that demanded correction. The empire needed to transform. But transformation required consistency. And consistency depended on leadership. This is where the long-term consequences of the succession system became most visible. A ruler shaped by confinement entered a world that required rapid, informed decision-making. The gap between preparation and expectation became more pronounced. Authority remained centralized in theory, but its effective use depended on the ability to understand and respond to complex conditions. Some rulers rose to this challenge. They supported reform efforts. They engaged with new ideas. They attempted to strengthen central authority while introducing necessary changes. These efforts reflected a recognition that the existing system required adjustment. But adjustment was not simple. The internal structure of the empire had evolved into a network of interests. The military, the bureaucracy, and the court all held positions that could influence outcomes. Reform threatened established roles, and threatened roles generated resistance. This resistance was not always direct. It could take the form of delay, of partial implementation, of selective compliance. The result was a pattern of reform that advanced unevenly. Progress was made, but was often incomplete. The system adapted, but not uniformly. This unevenness had consequences. It created gaps between intention and outcome. Policies were introduced, but not fully enforced. Institutions were established, but not consistently supported. The empire moved forward, but not with the cohesion required for sustained transformation. The role of the sultan remained central, but the nature of that role had evolved. He was no longer simply the guarantor of stability. He was expected to be the driver of reform. This required a level of engagement that went beyond traditional authority. It required knowledge, coordination, and persistence. These qualities were not guaranteed by the system that produced him. The Grand Vizier and other high officials continued to play critical roles. They provided continuity. They managed implementation. They navigated the complexities of reform. But their effectiveness depended on alignment with the ruler. And alignment was not always stable. Changes in leadership could disrupt progress. Policies could shift. Momentum could be lost. This lack of continuity limited long-term impact. At the same time, external pressures continued to increase. European influence extended into economic and political spheres. Agreements imposed conditions that affected internal autonomy. The empire was no longer operating in isolation. Its decisions were influenced by forces beyond its control. This added another layer of complexity. Reform was not only an internal necessity. It was also an external expectation. Balancing these pressures required precision, and precision required preparation. The legacy of the succession system remained evident. It had preserved the dynasty, but it had not consistently prepared its rulers for the demands of this new environment. The gap between authority and capability persisted. Some rulers managed to bridge that gap through determination and support. Others struggled to do so. The variability in leadership outcomes continued. The empire did not collapse under this pressure. It continued to function. It continued to adapt. But the margin for error narrowed. Decisions carried greater consequences. Delays had more significant effects. The system that had once allowed gradual adjustment now faced conditions that required rapid response. This tension defined the period. Stability remained essential, but stability alone was insufficient. Change was necessary, but change introduced risk. The balance between these elements became increasingly difficult to maintain. Within the palace, the structure of succession remained largely unchanged. Princes were still raised within controlled environments. Their preparation remained indirect. The moment of accession remained a transition without gradual integration. This continuity reinforced the underlying issue. Each new ruler entered power under similar conditions. Each faced the same challenges. Each operated within the same constraints. The system endured, but endurance was no longer the only measure of success. The empire's position in a changing world depended on its ability to evolve, and that evolution required confronting the legacy of its own structure, a structure that had once ensured survival through control, but now demanded adaptation through transformation. The outcome of this tension would not be immediate. It would unfold over time, through decisions, through reforms, through the gradual interaction between tradition and change. And at the center of it remained the same question, not how to preserve power, but how to use it effectively in a world that no longer allowed delay. The system did not collapse in a single moment. It adjusted, resisted, and endured until the pressures around it became impossible to absorb. What began as a solution to chaos had become a structure that could no longer fully respond to change. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Ottoman Empire faced a convergence of forces unlike anything in its earlier history. External pressure, internal reform, economic strain, and political transformation all interacted within a system that had been shaped over centuries by the need to survive rather than to evolve. The legacy of fratricide was no longer visible in its original form. Princes were no longer routinely executed upon accession. The brutality that had once defined succession had faded from immediate practice, but its influence remained embedded within the structure that replaced it. The caste system and the broader philosophy it represented had reshaped the nature of leadership. It had preserved the dynasty. It had prevented civil war, but it had also altered the preparation of rulers, the distribution of power, and the expectations attached to authority. These changes could not be reversed easily. They had become part of the empire's institutional identity. As reform efforts expanded, particularly during the Tanzimat period, the empire attempted to redefine itself. Administrative restructuring, legal reforms, and efforts to modernize military and economic systems reflected a recognition that survival required transformation. These reforms were significant. They introduced new frameworks of governance. They sought to standardize administration. They aimed to integrate the empire into a changing international order. But reform operated within existing constraints. The central authority of the sultan remained. The influence of established institutions persisted. The balance between tradition and change was difficult to maintain. This tension defined the final phase of the empire. The role of the ruler continued to evolve. He was no longer simply a monarch in the traditional sense. He became a figure navigating between competing demands: internal stability, external pressure, institutional resistance, reform expectations. This complexity required a level of coordination that the system struggled to sustain consistently. The legacy of succession played a role in this difficulty. Rulers continued to ascend without the depth of experience that might have supported long-term strategic planning. They relied on advisors. They depended on institutions. They operated within a framework that limited direct control. This did not eliminate their authority, but it shaped its effectiveness. The distribution of power became more formalized over time. New political movements emerged. Calls for constitutional governance gained traction. The idea of limiting absolute authority, once unthinkable, entered political discourse. This marked a significant shift. The empire was no longer defined solely by centralized rule. It was beginning to incorporate elements of shared governance. This transition was not smooth. It involved conflict, negotiation, reversal, progress followed by resistance. The system adapted, but not without strain. The young Ottoman and later young Turk movements reflected this shift. They challenged traditional structures. They advocated reform. They sought to redefine the relationship between ruler and state. These movements were not directly caused by the earlier system of fratricide, but they operated within the environment that system had helped create, an environment where authority had already become layered, where power was not absolute in practice, where adaptation had become necessary. The final decades of the empire were marked by this interplay between tradition and transformation. Reforms continued. Institutions evolved, but pressures intensified. External conflicts increased. Internal divisions deepened. The empire entered a period where survival required more than adjustment. It required reinvention. And reinvention is not a process easily achieved within structures designed for continuity. The succession system, in its final form, no longer relied on violence or confinement to the same extent. But its legacy persisted in the way leadership functioned, in the gap between authority and preparation, in the reliance on intermediaries, in the variability of governance. These elements influenced how the empire responded to its final challenges. The First World War accelerated these pressures. Decisions made under extreme conditions exposed the strengths and weaknesses of the system. Coordination became critical. Adaptation became urgent. The margin for error disappeared. The outcome was not determined by a single factor. It was the result of accumulated conditions: political, military, economic, institutional. Among these, the long-term structure of succession played a subtle but significant role. It had shaped leadership over generations. It had influenced how power was exercised. It had defined the balance between stability and adaptability. By the time the empire reached its final phase, these patterns were deeply embedded. They could not be separated from the broader context. The end of the Ottoman Empire did not occur because of fratricide, nor did it occur because of the cave system alone. But both were part of a continuum of decisions made to preserve the state under specific conditions. Decisions that were effective in their time, but carried consequences into the future. The empire lasted for centuries. Its longevity was not accidental. It was the result of systems designed to manage risk, control succession, and maintain continuity. Fratricide was one of those systems. It was harsh. It was uncompromising, but it addressed a real threat. The cave system replaced it with a different approach. Less immediate, less visible, but equally consequential. Together, they shaped the evolution of Ottoman governance. They influenced how rulers were formed, how power was distributed, how stability was maintained, and how adaptation was approached. In the end, the empire faced challenges that extended beyond any single system. Global change, industrialization, national movements, geopolitical conflict. These forces required responses that tested every aspect of the state. The succession system was one part of that larger structure. Its legacy remained present, not as an isolated cause, but as a contributing factor in how the empire functioned. The story of Ottoman fratricide is not only about violence. It is about decision-making under pressure, about the prioritization of stability, about the trade-offs between control and preparation. It is a reflection of how states respond to existential threats, and how those responses shape their future. The executions that once defined succession have long since ended, but the structure they created endured, in silence, in policy, in expectation, and in consequence. The empire itself is gone, but the questions it faced remain. How much control is necessary to ensure stability? How much freedom is required to enable growth? And at what point does a solution become a limitation? These are not questions confined to one empire or one era. They are part of a broader historical pattern, a pattern in which survival and transformation are often in tension. The Ottoman experience offers a case study in that tension, a system that achieved its purpose at a cost that became visible only over time. And in that delayed visibility lies its enduring significance.